I want to start with this quote here. Last time we began with a minute of silence, and I'd like to do that again. I don't have my cell phone. I'll have to watch the old-fashioned second hand on the wall there. Anyway, again, I don't know who originally said this. I learned this from, I think, from Cynthia Bourgeot at a retreat that I went to that she was leading for a centering prayer. The true silence is the silence within. And she said this in the context of talking about, when we first learn meditation or centering prayer, you want to be silent. And so you're kind of wrapped up a little bit in whenever there's an interruption or something, you have this beautiful moment of silence, and then a plane flies overhead, or the person next door fires up their lawnmower or whatever it is, and it's like, oh, my beautiful silence has been ruined. But of course, as you move into the discipline, the meditative discipline, the prayer discipline, whatever it is, you begin to discover that you don't actually need the outside to be silent, because the real silence is the one that's in here. And the goal, of course, is to get to the place where you can move into that meditative space anywhere, under any circumstances, in the middle of a mall, or a noisy street, or whatever it is, because you learn to focus on what's in here. And we'll see some of that in the quotes that I'm going to be sharing this evening. So let's begin with a minute of silence. And again, last time I asked you just to be silent and not to enter into any particular meditation tradition, but this time you can use the silence however you wish. And I'll just watch the clock for 1 minute of silence. Let's begin. Well, that is a minute. Thank you. I struggled with how to organize this tonight. There's so much information, and I didn't want to get bogged down in too much information and historical detail and stuff. So what I decided to do instead was to just go into quotations, to quote writings for our topic, and to do that chronologically. So I'm going to start with foundational texts in the New Testament for the Christian tradition of mysticism. And of course, that's, as I said, that's the one I'm going to be drilling down into. That's the one I'm most familiar with. As I was preparing this, I also was reminded that once we get into years that have 4 digits, I'm less confident. I don't know as much, because I've really focused a lot on things before the year 1000. Like, as I joke sometimes, once the years have 4 digits, it's just not interesting anymore. So I'm going to begin with these and talk a little bit about the context for them, or in this case, it's how these texts become key to the early Christian mystical tradition. And the first one is, if any of you want to be my disciples, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. And of course, that is about, again, setting aside yourself and moving into that path of following. So cross, of course, becomes a metaphor for all kinds of different things. And last time I talked about how Abraham and Ruth are these archetypes of the one who sets out on the spiritual journey, leaves the familiar behind, moves into the unknown. And so, in a sense, the cross could also simply be that I'm leaving my comfort behind, my comfortable, familiar stuff, and I'm going into a zone that I don't know, and I'm not sure where that's going to take me. Then, why do you worry about, there's this whole passage in Matthew where Jesus says, why do you worry about the clothes you wear and the food you eat and so on and so forth, and consider the lilies of the field and the birds of the air and so on and so forth, but seek first the kingdom of God and all these things will be given to you as well. So again, this is now about not being so concerned with material things and seeking first that spiritual thing. So again, I'm talking about these are foundational texts for the tradition as it emerges. I won't spend too much time with these because you'll see how these work themselves out in subsequent authors. The next set of texts is about prayer and oneness with God. So here's Jesus toward the end of John's Gospel. The glory, so here's Jesus praying. The glory that you have given me, I have given them, so that they may be one as we are one, I in them and you in me, that they may become completely one, so that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. So, of course, this is a very mystical text. This is about the oneness between Jesus and God, and between us and God and Jesus, and how it's all one and we are one. And so, of course, mysticism is often part of it. Mysticism is often the insight that everything is really one, everything is interconnected, and this text speaks very strongly to that. God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. So there is again this kind of mystical aspect to this. Love is important throughout the Christian mystical tradition, and we'll see that come up in different ways as we go along. And then from 1 Thessalonians, rejoice always, pray without ceasing. That's a very important little phrase. Give thanks in all circumstances. And so it sets a tone for the prayer, the kind of prayer that the mystics engage in. And then finally, a third set, giving to the poor. And this is especially important in the early centuries of the Christian mystical tradition. If you wish to, Jesus says to the rich young man who says, I've kept the law and I've done all the right things, what else do I need? And Jesus says, well, that's really great. But if you want to be perfect, if that's what you're looking for, go sell all your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. At the earliest Christian mystics, who were the desert fathers and mothers, or the desert elders, that's another way to translate that, really leaned heavily on this, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then, of course, at the end of the parable of the sheep and the goats, the judgment of the world, Jesus says, as you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. And again, that's becomes very, very important for that first phase. So that's just some foundational text. So let's go into the desert tradition. And I'll just say a few words about who these people are or were. For me, it's like they're alive now. I read the books and it's all very present to me. But who were these people? Well, the desert tradition really emerged out of the last two big persecutions, the Decian persecution in the 250s, and then the Diocletian persecution in the I think it's 311 to 315, or no, what is it, 308 to 311, something like that. Anyway, and what happened in Egypt, because this really starts in Egypt, is that there was a fellow named Paul Paul the Hermit, he comes to be called, and in the Decian persecution, an estate owner in Egypt, Roman, but he was a Christian, and some people came and warned him that there were soldiers coming and they were going to arrest him, and so he fled into the desert, and he wandered and stumbled upon a what had been a counterfeiter's lair. So people who had been counterfeiting coins in the desert. So they had caves and they had a spring there and some palm trees with date palms, and so it was like a little oasis, but it was abandoned. And so he took up residence there by himself. And of course, he had no way of communicating with people back home, so he didn't know what was going on. And he ended up living there and just kind of praying and kind of making it up as he was going. But he found that eventually this became his life. And so he's credited with, or let's say in the writings that constitute the writings associated with the desert tradition, there's various things. There's collections of sayings, there's little biographies and so on, and they're sort of gathered together into this small corpus of writings. He's credited with being the originator of this thing. The great one, of course, is Antony the Great, who goes out during the Diocletian persecution, similar story, to flee the persecution, and then finds there in the desert this intimate communion with God. And once Christianity, and of course then once the persecutions are off and so on, word gets around that there are these people out there and they're having this great time communing with God in the desert. And it becomes this huge trend. And people just flock into the Egyptian desert, which of course is not very far out when you think about Egypt and the Nile, and there's the agricultural land, and then you just have to kind of go up into the hills, and there you are in the desert, and there are caves and different things. And so it really kind of explodes in Egypt. And then there's a secondary kind of explosion that happens in Palestine around Jerusalem, which of course, if you were in the Constantine series that I did, becomes this kind of pilgrimage center, and so lots of people are kind of flocking there, and it becomes another place where this early monasticism happens. They're mostly hermits. They mostly live by them. Well, that's what a hermit does, is live by themselves. But of course, very quickly there are lots of hermits scattered around, and so they begin to form sort of loose communities. Because there aren't enough caves to go around, cenobitic communities emerge. So they gather together, they build like dormitories, and they live in these dormitories, but they stay in their cells through most of the week, and then they gather on Sundays to have fellowship and worship together. That's kind of the basic model. There's no set rule or anything. There's just some basic ideas about what they're doing, which is fasting and praying. But how do they live? Well, they work, and the main work is that they take palm fronds, and of course there are palm fronds all over, and they weave them into mats and baskets, and that's what they do. They sit, they pray, meditate, and they do a lot of recitation of psalms. They chant the Psalms. You begin to see the early beginnings of the Jesus prayer happening, different kinds of prayers of confession, and they sit and they weave these baskets and mats. And when they have a stack of them and they need to buy some more bread, they take them they go down into the valley where the agriculture is, closest village. They sell them in the market. They use the money to buy bread for themselves, bread and salt. And then whatever's left over, they give to the poor, and then they wander back into the desert with their bread and salt, and then they start all over again. And so that's how the early, this kind of very early tradition begins. So I'm just going to quote some here, and we can look at those, and then I'll also open it up to questions. But let's just go through here. So someone asked Abba Antony, so that's Antony the Great, "What should I keep to please God?" Antony answered, "Keep these things. Wherever you go, keep God before your eyes. Whatever you do, keep the example of Holy Scripture. Wherever you dwell, don't leave there soon. Keep these three things, and you will be saved. Abba Antony said, whoever sits in solitude and is quiet has escaped three wars: hearing, speaking, seeing. And yet, against one we battle continually, the heart. And so here is, that kind of inner struggle that goes on. So I can establish the outer silence, but that doesn't mean I have inner silence, right? And that's the kind of the recognition here, that I might be conflicted within myself for different reasons. Amma Matrona said, so there's men and women, and so Amma, mother, so Abba, father, Amma, mother. Amma Matrona said, it is better to have many people around you and live the solitary life in your will than to be alone and desire in your mind to be with the crowd. Same kind of idea, right? So it's better, right? The true silence is the inner silence. It's better, not to be in the desert and to be in the village with a bunch of people around you and still have this inner quiet life than it would be to be out in the desert and have your mind always distracted by, wanting to be there or wanting to go back or being obsessed with what somebody had said to you at one point, or I'll get revenge someday, this kind of thing. Similar sort of insight. And I've lost my cursor. There it is. And then we have they asked Abba Makarios, how should we pray? The old man said, I have to get rid of the picture here. The old man said, there is no need to speak much in prayer. Just stretch out your hands often and say, Lord, as you wish and as you know, have mercy on me. If you are struggling in your soul, add, help me. God knows what we need and shows mercy. One of the things about these first, say, two generations of desert ascetics, in Egypt especially, is most of them were poor, illiterate people. And so most of them were also Coptic speakers. These sayings probably were mostly originally recorded in Coptic. And then, but the things that have come down to us are, there's a Greek translation and there's a Latin translation. And those are the two recensions that have come down to us. This one is quoted, the ones I'm quoting are all out of the Greek translation, but in that little volume I also have the excerpts from the Latin translation. This is just excerpts, I don't have the whole thing, but of the Latin translation. They're very similar, and sometimes they have different ones of the saying, so obviously the translators chose different ones, and so on and so forth. So they're very simple. This is all about simplicity. It's all about simplicity. You do have stories in there sometimes of a wealthy person who has given away everything, sold everything, given everything away, and come into the desert. And I won't get into there's sort of lessons. Sometimes the stories, these are sayings, but sometimes they're also stories, and the stories have sort of moral lessons and so on. And there's an example of a story where this wealthy person who has physical, he's physically a little bit frail, has come into the desert, and he's brought a servant with him. And so there he is in his cell. He's not a cave. It sounds like he's built himself a hut or something. And he's got this servant who does stuff for him. And there's this other hermit nearby who comes over to say, hi, welcome to the community. He's like, what the heck? Servant? Like, I don't think you're taking this very seriously. And he berates him and all this kind of stuff. But the guy doesn't say anything. And later on, he learns about this fellow's physical ailments and the whole story. And he comes back later and says, I'm from a poor family. I had really nothing. And so when I came out here, I didn't have to give up much. It wasn't much of a change. But you gave away your estate and your big house and all your servants and stuff. And here you are living this life. And, I was wrong to judge you. So the moral lesson of that one is, don't judge people, because everybody's got a story. So you also get sort of stories like that. A brother came to visit a certain solitary. When he was going away, he said, forgive me, Abba, for making you break your rule of fasting. The solitary said, my rule is to receive you with hospitality and send you away in peace. Abba Antony said, I no longer fear God. Instead, I love God, for love throws fear out the door. And so here we have this emphasis on love. And so you see a lot of them talk about how, when they start, there's a strong emphasis on the fear of God, but eventually they come to a place where they realize that love is the way to go. And I think I have one more here from the desert tradition. Then oh no, here we get to Evagrius of Pontus. So how about if we just stop there for a minute? I'll stop my share and ask if you have any things you want to throw in at this point or ask before I get on to Evagrius of Pontus, my fave, and I'll explain why I like him so much in a minute. Well, of these things, we don't have any of the originals, as far as I know, or any sort of Coptic recension of it. Maybe there is. As I understand it, there isn't. But there are lots of things written in Coptic. We have the Bible in Coptic, or major portions of it. We have the old Coptic liturgy that was used into the Middle Ages in Egypt for the Coptic Church. We have, different devotional writings and so on. So there is a lot of stuff in Coptic that's out there. Yeah, the Nag Hammadi documents that were found, all that sort of heretical stuff, the Gospel of Thomas and that sort of thing. That was all in Coptic. Yeah. So Evagrius of Pontus, and if you look at his years here, 346 to 399, Pontus is the north coast of what is now Turkey. That, of course, was all Greek-speaking back in this time, and Pontus refers actually to the Black Sea. So he was from the town of Sinope on the north coast of what is now Turkey, there's this little peninsula thing in the middle of that coast, and so you can look it up later. And he was a reader in the church, so of course reading was a very specialized skill in this time, and they needed people to read the scriptures to the congregation, and so he was ordained as a reader in the church in that part of the world. I think he was actually living in Ankara, which is now Ankara, the capital of Turkey. And he was drawn to go out to the desert, and so he moved to Egypt. And because he was an educated person and so on, he's the one who wrote down a lot of stuff. And he went there and lived that life. And he also is a wonderful sort of analytical thinker. And so he takes these experiences, the laboratory of the cell, and he begins to kind of lay it out in a more systematic way, the inner processes going on and so on and so forth. So instead of these kind of, nice little aphorisms and, handy, memes for the internet of the day, he goes a little bit deeper. And so here's just some excerpts from one of his writings called On Prayer. Prayer is the communion of the nous. So the nous is, that's where we get our word noetic from, if you're familiar with that word at all. In Greek, there are different words for different aspects of the consciousness of the mind. And so the nous is the highest one. Noesis is kind of the highest sort of level of consciousness. So prayer is the communion of the nous, the higher mind, with God. What state then does the nous need so that it can reach out to God without deflection and commune with God without intermediary? And of course, he's talking about silence, right? Getting rid of distractions. When Moses tried to draw near to the burning bush, he had to remove his sandals from his feet. If then you wish to behold and commune with the one who is beyond sense perception and beyond concept, you must free yourself from every impassioned thought. In other words, from thoughts that evoke emotional reactions. And so here we see him using this episode out of the life of Moses, or the burning bush, metaphorically to reflect on this inner process of becoming present to God, or becoming aware of God, or beginning to commune with God. And of course, this is the project of the mystic, is this oneness with the larger, whatever it is. In the Christian context, it would be God. It could be, the universe, or whatever it is, that however you want to interpret that for yourself. Try to make the intellect deaf and silent during prayer. Then you will be able to pray. In other words, it's not about words, right? And it's not about images. Undistracted prayer is the highest intellection of the intellect. So it's the highest noosification of the nous, right? So it's the sort of highest aspect of this part of our mind is undistracted prayer. That's the highest manifestation of that. Do not pray for the fulfillment of your wishes, for they may not accord with the will of God. But pray as you have been taught, saying, your will be done in me. Always entreat God like this, for God desires what is good and profitable for you, whereas you do not always ask for this. Often when I have prayed, I have asked for what I thought was good and persisted in my petition. But when I have often obtained what I asked for, I have been very sorry that I did not ask for the will of God to be done, because the thing turned out not to be as I thought. And of course, be careful what you ask for, because you might get it. We practice the virtues in order to achieve contemplation of the inner essences, the logoi, of created things. And that should be from there. Can I type in here? No, I can't type in there. Okay. And from this, we pass to contemplation of the logos, who gives them their being. The logos is manifested when we are in a state of prayer. So, Judith, right? Judith, when we had our Constantine thing, Judith asked about the logos, the emperor being under the logos, and this sort of thing. So here we see this concept of the logos coming in. Christ, the logos, so the same thing, the organizing principle of the universe. And because the logos is the thing through which all things came into being, therefore aspects of the logos are present in everything in a kind of a scattered, smaller sense. And so everything has its logos, its organizing principle, which is a microcosm of the logos. So let's try this passage again. We practice the virtues. So by virtues, it means following the commandments, and sort of personal mental disciplines, in order to achieve contemplation of the inner essences of created things. So here now we're talking about pulling away the veil and seeing things for what they are, as opposed to our assumptions, or our assumptions about them. And from this, we pass to contemplation of the logos, who gives them their being. So we, through the, let's say this is sort of this idea of, take a rock and reflect on the rock. And of course, our word is rock, and that's a veil, because of course those sounds have nothing to do with this thing. And we have these preconceived notions about what a rock is, but we have to leave all that aside and simply see it, perceive it in its essence, in its sort of deepest, whatever it is. And as we do that, we begin to contemplate the logos itself, the great logos, right? So again, you see that moving through the particular to the general, to the universal. Among the desert elders, not so much in Egypt, but in the Palestine area, there was a whole group of them who there was this idea that, as I said in last week's session, the Garden of Eden story, the Genesis 2 and 3, is this sort of verbal icon that our natural state is to have intimate communion with God. And so out of this idea arose the concept that the natural world is the way that God meant it to be, and our human world of houses and domesticated animals and crops that we sow and so on and so forth is this perversion of God's natural world. And so to really get back to the garden, one had to leave the human created world behind. And in some ways, these desert hermits are doing this, but these guys, and it was, as far as I know, it was all guys, basically left everything. They didn't even live in caves. They just lived off the land and foraged like wild animals and communed with the wild animals and were naked. They had no clothes because, of course, that's how Adam and Eve were originally. And so there are some writings about these people. And so that's related to this idea that our human categories and things veil the deeper essence of what God has made, right? So anyway, you see why I love Evagrius of Pontus. Now he sort of, he's not saying anything new in some ways, but he's putting it a certain way, and he's putting it into the context of this contemplative prayer and this ascetic desert tradition. But he is considered the beginning of what's called the Evagrian tradition. And the heyday of the Evagrian tradition was from Evagrius up until the 600s, when we get to Maximus the Confessor. And I'm going to have a quote from Maximus. And then we kind of begin to shift over into other things. Oh, Immanuel Kant, that year has 4 digits. I don't, there may be because some of this stuff is related to Platonic philosophy. These philosophically, most of these people were Platonists of some kind. The dominant school was, well, by this time the dominant school was Neoplatonism, but so a lot of this is looking at the scriptures through a Platonic lens. And I've often said to people, I'm a Neoplatonist Christian, or a Christian Neoplatonist. And so there may be, because Kant, of course, would have known all of that philosophy stuff, and he may well have been building on some of that. Okay. So, all right, so let's keep going with Evagrius here. So, never try to see a form or shape during prayer. Do not long to have a sensory image of angels or powers or Christ, for this would be madness. Spiritual pride is the start of illusions of the intellect. Under its impulse, the intellect attempts to disclose the deity in shapes and forms. I shall say again what I have said elsewhere. Blessed is the intellect, the nous, that is completely free from forms during prayer. And so again, you can hear the Platonism there, right? Because there's the realm of forms in Plato, but what Christian Platonism, in a sense, does is say, well, God made the forms, right? So the forms are themselves created, and God is something beyond the forms even. So we don't even want to be dwelling in the realm of forms. We want to become free of forms and to become completely, to have them not stand between us and our union with God. I was going to say something else about this, but spiritual pride. And in this tradition, spiritual pride is considered the most insidious of all the pathway, not pathway, pathe, is that the plural? Of the impulses, because in spiritual pride, you convince yourself that I'm fasting and I'm praying and I'm holding all night vigils and I'm giving away everything to the poor, and ain't I great? And out of that comes all kinds of really bad stuff. And a lot of the horrible stuff that the church has done through the centuries has to be tied to this spiritual pride, because we are the ones in authority, we have the true teaching, we know what we're doing. Spiritual pride. And so it's interesting here. Spiritual pride is the start of illusions of the intellect, such as that I have some kind of a authority to set you straight and maybe even burn you at the stake. So let the virtues of the body lead you to those of the soul. So the virtues, here we have this sequence again, and again there's this threefold understanding of the person. There's the body, the soul, and the spirit, or the body, the reason, and the nous. And so later on that gets divided into more things, but at this point it's basically three. Again, going back to Plato. So let the virtues of the body, so self-discipline in the body, lead you to those of the soul, so self-discipline in the mind, and the virtues of the soul to those of the spirit, spiritual consciousness, or the nous again. And these in turn to immaterial and principial knowledge. So knowledge of the principles, the origin of things, where stuff, that basically it all comes from God and the Logos and so on and so forth. But this last step later comes to be called to attain theology. And one of the big differences between the Eastern tradition and the Western tradition is that in the Eastern tradition, theology is understood not as an academic discipline, but as an intimate relationship with God. And in the West, of course, theology is something you teach in the university. So in the East, theology is attained through self-discipline, constant prayer, and so on and so forth, and you attain to theology, you reach this kind of consciousness. So in the East, there are only a few people who are called theologians. One of them is it Basil or is it Gregory Nazianzen? One of them, I think it's Gregory Nazianzen, is called the theologian. And then you have Simeon the New Theologian, who's in the late 900s and early 1000s, and we'll get to him in a minute here. So anyway, let's move on to the next thing. So the end of this Evagrian tradition is Maximus the Confessor. And so I'm just going to read this quote from him, and you'll see how this takes on this kind of form. When our intellect, nous, has shaken off its many opinions about created things, then the inner principle of truth appears clearly to it, providing it with a foundation of real knowledge and removing its former preconception, as though removing scales from the eyes, as happened in the case of Paul. So again, we're using this as a metaphor. For an understanding of scripture that does not go beyond the literal meaning, and a view of the sensible world that relies exclusively on sense perception, are indeed scales, blinding the soul's visionary faculty and preventing access to the pure logos of truth. There it is. What more can I say? There's Maximus is considered sort of the summarizer of the Evagrian tradition. He's harder to read. He's a lot more wordy. I like Evagrius better, but Maximus is, like I said, he's the great summarizer of that tradition. Yeah, and that's just particular to this time and the Greek language that they're using. There's a debate in the Hebrew scriptures. There's really no word for soul, like soul. The Greek word for soul is psyche, like psyche, psyche, and so you can see that's a rational word. Remember, these are the Greeks, yes. Right? Philosophers. And in the Hebrew of the Hebrew scriptures, you have the word nephesh, and when they translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek in the Septuagint in Alexandria in 200-300 years before the 1.5 to 2.5 years before the time of the New Testament, they chose the word psyche to translate nephesh, and there's a lot of and so of course when then the Bible is translated into Latin, they use the word alma, which is soul, to translate that word too. So there's some debate, and to me, I think what the rabbis in Alexandria were saying is that one of the things, nephesh is the whole being, right? When God breathed into Ha'adam, the Adam, the earth creature, the Ha'adam, the red earth creature, became a living nephesh, a living being. But what I think the rabbis were trying to communicate as they were translating the Hebrew scriptures into Greek is that the faculty of reason has something to do with the nephesh. That makes the nephesh different from the other animals, because the other animals also have the breath of life in them, but they are not called living nefshim, right? They don't have that designation. So what's the difference here? So you have to think rabbinically, right? You have to think how in rabbinic discourse you divide things and categorize and specify, and how is this different from this, and how is this like this, and so on and so forth. So that comes into the Greek. So in this tripartite understanding that they had at this time, you can think of it as the soul, the psyche, was understood to be the seat of discursive thought, right? And then the soma, the body, had the kind of physical impulses, and then you have the nous, which is this higher kind of consciousness, which transcends thought. So so the psyche was seen as the seat of reason. That's where the reason was lodged. So that doesn't mean that you have to see it that way, and that doesn't mean that our English word has to mean that. But in order to understand these texts, we have to understand that. So I'm going to skip way ahead, and yet not that far ahead. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book The Way of a Pilgrim. It's an anonymous Russian work from the mid-19th century, but it is the main way that we in the West have come to know the Jesus prayer: Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. And so the Way of a Pilgrim is a story, and we don't know if it's a real story. We don't know if it's autobiographical. We don't know if it's just a made-up story just to teach the Jesus prayer to people. We don't know. But what happens in the East is that in the 1700s, there's a pair of monks in Greece, and they take all of these old writings, and so a lot of the desert writings, and then Evagrius of Pontus and others, a whole bunch of others, including Maximus, and on and on and on, up into the Middle Ages, because of course they're in the 1700s, so they have access to all these other things, and they make this big anthology of these spiritual things, and they call it the Philokalia. And so it's first published in Venice, ironically, but it becomes this spiritual classic for Eastern Orthodoxy, and it's just out there and around, and it influences Eastern Orthodox spirituality. And one of the things that really takes hold in Eastern Orthodox spirituality is the Jesus prayer as a key thing. Now, the Jesus prayer is like a mantra, of course, that you recite over and over and over and over again. But here's the main character in The Way of a Pilgrim, and he's read this passage in First Thessalonians that says, pray without ceasing. And he's gone to all these different priests, you have to think in Russia, this is in the 1800s, different Orthodox priests asking, what does this mean? How do I do this? And so he finally finds this starets, which is like an older monk in a monastery that is as a sort of mentoring responsibility to the other monks. So he finally gets an interview because he's basically the son of merchants. His family owned this store, and he decides to embark on this journey to seek the meaning of this passage, pray without ceasing. And so the starets says the following to him. Now listen, I will read to you about how to learn the unceasing interior prayer. The starets opened the Philokalia, selected a passage from St. Simeon, the new theologian, and began to read. Find a quiet place to sit alone and in silence. Bow your head and shut your eyes. Breathe softly. Look with your mind into your heart. Recollect your mind, that is, all its thoughts, and bring them down from your mind into your heart. As you breathe, repeat, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, either quietly with your lips or only in your mind. Strive to banish all thoughts, be calm and patient, and repeat this exercise frequently. So the pilgrim is now, he has his kind of thing he's been looking for. And so the rest of the story is how he kind of deepens this and expands this. And another monk gives him a chokchi, which is sort of like Eastern Orthodox prayer beads. It's a string of 100 beads, and begins to say to him, it's not just enough to do this every so often. If you're really serious about this, you have to do, I want you to do, 1,000 a day, and then when he reports back, I've done it, I've got to 1,000 a day. Okay, I want you to go 2,000 a day now. And so you use the chokchi to do that. Anyway, that's the rest of the story there. But this is how, from this book, we learn about the Jesus Prayer in the West. And if you ever read Franny and Zoe by Schlesinger, Catcher in the Rye, that guy. Franny and Zoe reads this, comes across this, The Way of a Pilgrim, and begins to do the Jesus Prayer in that story on the bus. And it's the kind of thing, this kind of, as we get into later on about techniques, it's the kind of thing you can do while you're waiting in line and so on. And of course, it doesn't have to be Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. It can be like any mantra. It can be anything that's meaningful. So let's leave the East and come to the West. Now, we're almost out of time here, but we did start late. Let me just check in with people. And I guess part of what I need to say is that at the beginning of this tradition, asceticism and mysticism were inseparable. Okay. And so that's why you have this strong ascetic emphasis. Later on, the two kind of come apart, right? Like they don't, but at that point, people didn't understand how you could be one without the other. Like if you were an ascetic, you were a mystic. And if you were a mystic, then you were an ascetic. And they just went hand in hand. Because the discipline of the body and the mind, the self-denial, was seen as the basic building block in order to move to this higher consciousness. You see the same thing in Buddhism, right? In serious Buddhism, like you leave stuff behind and you engage in these disciplines and you do this thing and you meditate, and it's hard work. But as you do that hard work, as you do that discipline, you begin to achieve or arrive at a kind of a higher consciousness. So it's the same idea. It's the same basic idea. And I hadn't heard about most of these people either until I started kind of immersing myself in this. And as I said, the ones that I've showed up to now are known very well in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. So the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, and so on, and the Coptic Church and the Syrian Orthodox Church, based in Antioch and so on. But so less known in the West, but more now. I mean, we, obviously through scholarship and just exchange and so on and so forth. And so now that's why I said now we're going to leave the East and we're going to move into the Western tradition, which is, and I'm starting with Hildegard of Bingen, because the Eastern and Western traditions aren't that different until you get to about the 700s or so on, and that's when they begin to sort of drift apart and take on a different spirit. And one of the reasons is Benedict of Nursia, the founder of the Benedictine order, and the Western Church begins to go in a different direction from the Eastern Church, and this sort of opens the door or paves the way for things to evolve in a different way. The Eastern Church stays pretty closely wed to these early models of monasticism and of discourse around prayer and coming close to God and the energies of God, participating in the energies, and becomes this movement in the kind of Middle Ages called hesychasm, which is in the way of a pilgrim. That's essentially a form of hesychasm, which hesychasm means the hesychia is the Greek word for silence, and so an emphasis on the silence and the mystical contemplation of God, and so on and so forth. So anyway, that's I could go on, but so yeah, no, this is about So what did people do? Where are our mystical traditions? How do they grow? How do they develop? That's what I'm really exploring.